What is going on, everybody? James Hancock here. I'm back to review a movie which I think is going to be one of the surprise sleeper hits of the fall, Outlaw Johnny Black, a movie co-written by and directed by and also starring the great Michael Jai White. And I saw it last night up in Times Square with a small, but for the most part, very vocally enthusiastic audience. And I totally understand why, because Outlaw Johnny Black is that rare thing, an unpretentious, low-budget genre film that actually manages to deliver some serious laughs, some fantastic fight scenes. If you like westerns, if you like martial arts movies, and you like comedy, I promise you're going to have a good time. And for me, the fact that Michael Jai White is now directing is a cause for celebration, because he's been grinding and working in the world of showbiz for several decades at this point. I mean, I first saw him in Spawn back in 1997 or 1998, whenever the hell that came out, but he had a cool part in The Dark Knight. He's been featured in some kick-ass action flicks like Blood and Bone, and of course he's got the film Black Dynamite to his name, which I still think is probably his finest hour as a performer in a movie against which Outlaw Johnny Black is going to be judged. Perhaps harshly, perhaps unfairly. I might like Black Dynamite a little bit more, but that story had the good fortune of being continued as an animated series for a while. But I'll just come out right and say it. I fucking loved Outlaw Johnny Black. And when talking about the appeal of a low-budget genre film or an exploitation film or a grindhouse film, it's easy to get carried away with your praise because some of the scenes are so outrageous or just so delightfully entertaining that it just kind of knocks you sideways in comparison to a more mainstream, conventional movie. But if I'm a little guilty of overselling this movie, I don't care, because in the end, we are throwing down money to be entertained, and this movie was 100% successful on that front. And if there's the occasional scene where you might say, woo, this movie is really suffering from its budgetary limitations, or the occasional clumsy scene, you can totally forgive it, because every once in a while a scene will come along in this movie where it's so fucking funny that it erases like the 10 minutes of clunkiness that might have preceded it, where like it totally redeems itself, everything is forgiven. And in the end, what makes this movie successful is that it's made with total sincerity. Michael Jai White is making the best movie that he possibly can. You can tell he still fucking loves movies. He loves making movies. He loves watching movies, because there are a lot of really cool kind of old school classic Western homages tucked away inside it. But what makes this movie successful is that it's not ironic. It's not winking at the audience. Like a lot of movies that are pretending to be an exploitation film, they're kind of like making fun of themselves while telling a story at the same time. Outlaw Johnny Black does not do any of that bullshit, because I think Michael Jai White understands in his bones that if you're going to make a successful low-budget genre film, you have to believe in the story in your heart and soul that you're making the best movie you possibly can. And you have to put your all into it, even if you don't necessarily have all the money that you would like, to make the movie under ideal circumstances. And it works, or I should say, like a good 50% of this movie is vastly more entertaining than most conventional films that have considerably larger budgets. And the best way I can describe my reaction is that I walked out of the theater with just the world's biggest smile on my face. And in the interest of full disclosure, I should admit, about 30 minutes before I walked into the movie, I may or may not have eaten a little edible, and it kicked in right as the movie was getting good, because the movie is a little slow to get out of the gate. And I might as well go ahead and share the official synopsis. Hell-bent upon avenging the death of his father, Johnny Black vows to gun down Brett Clayton and becomes a wanted man in the process, while posing as a preacher in a small mining town that's been taken over by a notorious land baron. And perhaps it's unfair to say that the movie's a little slow to get out of the gate, but if you show up to this movie expecting Black Dynamite, you're going to initially be frustrated, because this movie takes the revenge plot very seriously, and the villain is played straight. I think a lot of people who are expecting the Black Dynamite experience but set in the Wild West initially are going to be kind of thrown by the fact that the villain is a pretty hardcore evil bastard. And I should just go ahead and give a shout out to the actor who plays him. Chris Browning plays Brett Clayton, and let's just say that when it comes to certain attitudes that might have been prevalent in the late 19th century, he just leans all the way in, and it makes for a very compelling adversary for Michael Jai White. But where this movie really starts to get good is after the outlaw Johnny Black encounters the Reverend Percy, played by Byron Menz, who is a great wingman, and they've worked together in the past. Byron Menz is a huge part of Black Dynamite and its appeal, and he's got that great classic kind of Rudy Ray Moore delivery style when it comes to his comedy and his rhymes and his songs and all that stuff. But they get attacked by Indians, and outlaw Johnny Black assumes that Reverend Percy is dead and goes to this town where he has to masquerade as a reverend for a couple days, and that's where the comedy just starts kicking kicking into high gear. It is so fucking funny watching this badass, huge, strong dude who's really good at kicking people and shooting people, trying to pretend to be a reverend. However, his father was a reverend. He remembers some sermons, so he's got enough kind of little bits and pieces tucked away in his head where he can fake it. And what makes the brew particularly potent is that you have these two beautiful sisters, Jessie Lee and Bessie Lee, played by Anika Noni Rose and Erica Ash. And the character of Reverend Percy is betrothed to one. He's been writing letters to her for years, and they are about to get engaged. So Michael Jai White has to pretend to be in love with that sister, but secretly he's in love with the other sister. And let's just say it gets very complicated very, very quickly. But the sexually suggestive humor in this movie is first rate. I mean, this movie's PG-13, whereas Black Dynamite was a hard R. I mean, Black Dynamite had like a full-blown orgy. Like in the first 5 minutes of the movie, it was a very different kind of movie. But the way Erica Ash is able to play the sexually suggestive humor for laughs had me fucking screaming. I mean, Michael Jai White at one point is trying to give a sermon. He's in church, and she's just making gestures at him and like tonguing and like writhing in ecstasy in her chair. I mean, I was screaming with laughter at certain points. I mean, like curled up in my side in my chair. But the laughter I was experiencing, it wasn't universal across the theater. There was one person who was audibly snoring throughout the majority of the movie, and I don't think that's unfair. Once again, there are parts of this movie where it's like, it almost feels inert, like they've deliberately slammed on the brakes. And like, wait a second, like what movie are we watching here? Like it's no longer funny, it's no longer exciting. Like what is happening? It's not consistently entertaining throughout. It has these like extreme peaks and valleys, but when it's entertaining, oh my God, you will lose your goddamn mind. So I do think there are a lot of people that'll struggle to get onto the movie's wavelength. But then there are other people where they'll be like, oh my God, like I've been waiting for years just for a movie like this. But what's great about this flick is how it confirms the fact that even though Michael Jai White's getting a little older, I mean, he started competing in martial arts tournaments in the late 80s. He's been doing this for a long time. He is no longer a 20-year-old man. But the movie confirms that he doesn't need to be able to throw the world's best high kick in order to make an entertaining movie, because he is so fucking funny in this, and he's in the director's chair, so if he just wants to direct himself in comedies moving forward, he could. But let's put some respect on his name when it comes to martial arts, because even in the world of mixed martial arts, Michael Jai White has a lot of respect. I will frequently hear athletes talking about how they would watch like Michael Jai White's tutorial videos, or they would watch his videos or watch his movies, learning how to throw kicks with more power, with more hip dexterity. And that is a very rare thing. Usually it's the stars who look up to the real martial artists. It's incredibly rare to hear from legit combat sports practitioners that they're being inspired by movie stars. And the story that I've always heard is that he went to Legends Gym in Hollywood and he was demonstrating how to perform a sidekick where he does a little hop step before the sidekick. And he ended up breaking the chain on the heavy bag. And it sounds like a scene out of a movie, but it's legit. And like, if you're breaking the chain on the heavy bag, well, you are generating some serious fucking power. And you can see that in the trailer for the movie. He absolutely still has all of his power. But even though he's getting a little older, Michael Jai White still has this incredible chemistry with Byron Mins. And as a comedic kind of action duo, I hope they'll make like 10 more fucking movies. They are incredible together. They have amazing chemistry. And when it comes to the kicks in the martial arts, Michael Jai White, he's got a good eye for talent. He brought in Randy Couture. I mean, Randy Couture at one time was the light heavyweight champ and then the heavyweight champ in the fucking UFC. And the movie also brings in Donald Cowboy Cerrone as Crackshot Bob. And that's one of the funniest fucking scenes of the movie. And if you don't know who Cowboy Cerrone is, he never had a title in the UFC. But he was one of those guys who was famous for taking fights with anyone, anytime, anywhere, almost to his disadvantage, where he would fight so much that slowly but surely his body started to pay the price. But at one time, he might not still have the record, but at one time, Donald Cerrone had more wins in the UFC than any other fighter. He was just one of those seasoned, salty pros. So when you see him show up in this movie and playing a scene for laughs and doing it successfully, I mean, that was one of my favorite scenes of the movie. And I'll play a quick clip because it's been available online for a while.
You do that shit again, I'm gonna shoot your nuts off alphabetically.
And if you follow combat sports, you know sometimes fighters have a really tough time adjusting to life after their fighting career is over. So the fact that they have an outlet with movies like this is a wonderful, beautiful thing. And I think I'm going to keep that line in perpetuity where Michael Jai White says, you do that shit again, I'm going to shoot your nuts off alphabetically. When he said I'm going to shoot your nuts off alphabetically, I lost my goddamn mind. But the movie is full of great jokes like that, but it's also filled with a lot of old-fashioned Western tropes that legitimately caught me off guard. Like the first 20 or 30 minutes of the movie, I was like, is this going to be just an old-fashioned morality tale, like an old-fashioned Western, where you've got brawls breaking out in bars, like a good old-fashioned tale of good and evil. That was not the kind of movie that I was hoping for or anticipating when I bought a ticket. But as the movie got like 20, 30 minutes deep, I was like, all right, I guess that is the movie we are watching. But then, like I said, once he assumes the identity of the preacher, that's where the comedy reaches another level. And the movie manages to pull something off that's very hard to do, where it has a lot of scenes involving preaching without ever coming across as preachy, because both Byron Menz as well as Michael J. White have to do a little bit of preaching in this. I mean, Reverend Percy is one of the main characters, whether it's the real Reverend Percy or the character masquerading as Reverend Percy. But what blew my mind was how there's a scene in a church that's managing to juggle several things simultaneously. We have all this crazy sexually suggestive humor going on in the audience, and then you have an outlaw martial artist pretending to be a preacher on stage who's having a total panic attack trying to pull a sermon out of his ass. And then it manages also to be a genuinely sincere, moving, like effective sermon that totally caught me off guard. And I'm not going to say this is like a faith-based movie, because the moment people hear faith-based movie, they start thinking, oh shit, it's going to be yet another piece of propaganda about some religious cause. And you're immediately limiting your audience to a very small, select audience that loves faith-based movies. But I'll say this, if there were a church nearby that had sermons as entertaining as the sermon delivered by Michael J. White, I would probably start going to church again. And I have not been a regular churchgoer since like 1995, back when I was in high school and I was required to. But as far as criticisms go, the movie is inconsistent and is uneven. I imagine when people will like buy this on Blu-ray or rent it online, after they've seen it all the way through, they'll probably have certain scenes that they keep coming back to. But I don't imagine I'm going to watch it in its entirety over and over and over again. But it's got like probably 10 different scenes that I'm going to want to watch multiple times. Also, I wouldn't have minded a few more martial arts scenes. Admittedly, this is a Western. There's lots of fancy gunplay, and I'm going to have more on that in a second, my spoiler section. But when you see a Michael J. White movie, you want to throw some kicks. Even though he's getting older, I still want to see him throw some kicks. And so it's got 2.5 really good martial arts scenes, which some might say that's plenty. But I wouldn't have minded a few more martial arts scenes. But it does have a lot of good action. Also, I wouldn't have minded a little bit of nudity. And maybe I'm just a creepy old man, but like Black Dynamite, it leaned all the way in on that front. Or at least it had that one like orgy scene early on in the flick. I think because this movie does have a lot of religion, at least in the context of the story. Once again, it's not a faith-based movie, but there is a lot of religion in it. Perhaps Michael J. White and his team had an internal conversation where they're like, look, let's just do a PG-13, go for more of a family-friendly vibe, like more of like an old-fashioned adventure vibe that occasionally has some sexually suggestive humor, occasionally has some good fight scenes, but on the whole, like a whole family can go see it. And I get it. It's a different tone. It's a different style than Black Dynamite. And as far as spoilers go, I'll keep this section brief, but I do want to call attention to some of his homages to classic Westerns, some of which are more obvious than others, but it just shows how he really knows his stuff. Like, he's watching good fucking movies to get inspired to make a movie like Outlaw Johnny Black, because the title sequence basically takes the style of the title sequences from A Fistful of Dollars, as well as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and throws them together, where you've got that black, white, and red animation combined with the paintbrush effect that Leone used so well back in the 1960s. The only thing that really holds back the title sequence of this movie is that the music isn't as good as the music by Ennio Morricone. But Ennio Morricone, he is no longer with us, so he was unavailable to do the work on this. But there's another great homage about 2/3 of the way through the movie where I was like, God damn, if you're watching My Name is Nobody and getting inspired by the slap sequence in that movie and then doing your own variation on it, well then I'm a very happy genre movie fan, because with Michael J. White, you've got a legit martial artist combining his natural skills with that kind of strange, slapsticky hyper reality of Italian spaghetti westerns. And anyway, I was just in hog heaven as the scene unfolded. And then every once in a while, just for good measure, he'll throw in just an overt classic martial arts movie reference. At one point, he does this move that's followed by the camera zooming in on him, where it's like the exact same choreography and positioning that Bruce Lee employed in this one really good scene from Enter the Dragon. And Michael J. White, yeah, he fucking sells it. And I think in the end, that's what makes this movie work so well. In spite of all of its budgetary limitations, it's not tongue-in-cheek. It's not laughing at itself. It's not one of those fake exploitation movies. Michael J. White clearly loved the story he was telling. He was invested. He's invested as a performer. He's invested as a director. And he sold me on his vision. And I feel like that's the key to not being a fake exploitation movie, is that you have to be completely invested in your own world that you're creating, your own vision, no matter what limitations you might have. And I think there's a very good chance that this movie might end up being on my top 10 list at the end of the year. So I don't think Michael Jai White is going to replace Sergio Leone as anybody's favorite director, but I will be seeing everything he directs from now on. Because in the end, as an actor as well as a filmmaker, Michael Jai White's trying to give as much bang for your buck as humanly possible. And in an era where so many movies feel like, leftovers that have been in the refrigerator for a week and then you're heating them back up, like most movies are pretty bland, devoid of flavor, risk averse. Here comes Michael Jai White. It's like, you know what? Movies should be a fucking blast. In spite of all their flaws, and this movie does have flaws, but in the end, you should walk out of the movie with a giant smile on your face. You're like, God damn, that was time and money well spent. So Outlaw Johnny Black, I loved it. I really enjoyed it, and I encourage more people to go see it. Check out the trailer. If you find yourself giggling or laughing or smiling, then this is probably the movie for you. So that's all I've got to say about Outlaw Johnny Black. Hope you enjoyed this review. If so, please consider liking the video, subscribing to the channel, hitting that notification bell. But I hope everybody has a fantastic weekend. But more importantly, as always, onwards and upwards.